Well, shalom, y'all. This is Dr. John Morris, and I want to talk today about Isaiah 40, verses 1 through 11, just the first part of the chapter. And I'm going to be doing this in the format for the class, where I talk about the literary markers, the historical and literary context, the themes of the passages, any kind of Old Testament, New Testament parallels, and then finally an application. And I'm going to go through it. I'll try to give you a brief summary to start off with so you don't have to listen to the whole thing to get the idea. But I think this is a very important passage, and I want to make sure that I spend enough time that you really get the detail. There are an incredible number of Old Testament parallels in this passage, and an even more incredible number of New Testament parallels in this passage. So there's a whole lot going on in these 11 verses, so I want to make sure that I take the time to cover them completely. Well, maybe not completely, because there's always something more there, but in enough detail so you can get an idea of the importance of what's going on here. So, first of all, the summary. The literary markers here is Isaiah 39 and 40 is a very sharp contrast. Isaiah 1 through 39 is really sometimes called the book of judgment, and 40 through the end of the book is called the book of comfort. And chapter 40 starts at it. In fact, it starts off with the word comfort. So we have a clear break between what has happened. God has been judging the people, and now God is going to give an idea of comfort for the remnant. And we'll get into a lot more detail about that. So the historical and literary context is the exile. It may be pre-exile, maybe during the exile. We don't really know just based on the passage. But this is probably a prediction that Isaiah is making about the exile. Now, the important thing about the exile is the Hebrews have lost everything. If you look at what it means to be a Hebrew, there are three defining characteristics. There's temple, there's Torah, and there's the promised land. And they've lost all of them. They've lost the temple has been destroyed. They've lost the promised land. They're in exile. They're in subjection to the Babylonians. And they've been judged under the Torah. They've kind of lost the Torah too. So they have lost everything. And they have two big questions in their lives. Is it possible to physically return to the promised land? Is it possible to spiritually return to a relationship with God? How can we atone for our sins? We know we're being judged. So that's kind of the historical context that's going on there. Literary context, again, we've talked about the shift between judgment and to comfort. And just as sure as the judgment was in the first part of Isaiah, the comfort is going to be exactly as sure in the second part of Isaiah. And we get a little piece of the sovereignty of God there. So we'll see how that works out. Old Testament parallels, we're constantly pulling from the book of Exodus here. In fact, even the words in the wilderness, which is the Hebrew name for the book of the book of Numbers, is in this passage. So it's this context of the covenant of God, the faithfulness of God, regardless of what the people do. Just like the people abandoned God in the Exodus, but God remained faithful, the same thing will happen in the exile. They may be sent away from the promised land, but God is still their God. So we'll see that working out. New Testament parallels are just Jesus. Jesus shows up almost every verse here. In fact, there's one that I can almost guarantee that you don't know, one of the parallels about Jesus in the New Testament, but I'm going to save that to the end to give you an incentive to watch all the way through. But Jesus shows up again and again and again here. This passage is quoted to tell who Jesus is. John the Baptist uses it in the beginning of Mark, and Jesus actually quotes from Isaiah too to talk about what his ministry is. So an enormous amount of parallels. And we'll get into this idea of the way or the path, which is very important in the New Testament. And finally, the application, I'll save that again to the end to give you a little bit of incentive. So that's sort of where we're going. That's what I see in this passage. And let's dig into some of the details. If we look at the way 40 starts, it is a clear shift and change. We've had a narrative passage and previous to 39 and in 39, and all of a sudden in 40 we get back to the prophecy. I call this maybe a comfort oracle, I don't know, but it is a prediction of comfort. It is a promise of comfort. And we read through it, and we read through down to about verse 11, and then we see verse 12, there's a subject shift. Verse 11 has been talking about the bearer of good news and things like that. But in 12, it starts talking about the power of God. And I think what's going on here is God is making a promise in verses 1 through 11. And, there's always some old Jewish deacon in the back row that goes, yeah, God, you might be promising that, but how are you going to fulfill that? And verses 12 and following talk about the mighty power of God, the God that can fulfill all this stuff. So the clear break here. And so we're dealing with a passage of Isaiah 40, 1 through 11, and it's talking about comfort. It's introducing the book of comfort, 39 through 66. I'm sorry, 40 through 66. And it's going to tell us that God is going to comfort the people by returning them physically. God is going to comfort the people by returning them spiritually to a right relationship with God. Now, the problem is, historically, or kind of the social religious context, is they have lost the temple. And the temple is critical for Israel. The temple is where God is. It is the intersection of heaven and earth. It is where mankind meets God. It depends on the relationship, and if the relationship is marred in any way, God has given them a sacrificial system to restore that relationship. But it's all involved in the temple as far as they're concerned. If they need to make a sacrifice to God, they have to go to the temple, because the temple is where heaven and earth intersects, where mankind meets God. If you have a problem with God, that's where you go to fix it. So the people are saying, we've lost the temple. How can we be in a correct relationship with God? How can we be restored to the promised land? So all these kinds of questions are going on. They don't know the answers to. They're slaves in Babylon. They're subject to the rulers of Babylon. All that they have, they've lost, and they don't know how it can be restored. But God is saying, I'm still God, and I'm going to offer you comfort. All you have to do is have faith in me. So this idea of a physical return and a spiritual return are critical questions for the Hebrews all through the 500s up to the time of Jesus. There's some good evidence that they are still looking for the return in the time of Jesus, because physically they've returned to the promised land. They've rebuilt the temple, but if you think about it, in Roman times, they're still under subjection to a foreign power. They don't have religious freedom, and more importantly, the presence of God has not come back to the temple. If you read Ezekiel carefully, you'll see that in Ezekiel, the presence of God leaves the temple. And that's critical, because if God is no longer there, then the temple has no function or purpose. And we never see the presence of God come back to the temple. So the Jews are still kind of wondering, are we still in exile? Have we been forgiven? God hasn't come back to the temple. What do we need to do? So even into the time of Jesus, they're looking for this person described here in Isaiah that we'll talk about some more as we get in more detail, and also in Isaiah 53 and some other places. So they're looking for someone to come back and restore a relationship between them and God. Now, of course, from our New Testament perspective, when that actually happens, when Jesus, the Son of God, comes back to the temple, they reject him. They know this Isaiah stuff, but they go, no, that can't be Jesus. And because I know what the Messiah is going to be like, and Jesus is nothing like what the Messiah is going to be like. So I would invite you to also read Isaiah 53 with this passage, because it gives you a very clear picture of who Jesus is going to be. So even in the time of Isaiah, he is prophesying this. So it's kind of multiple layers of fulfillment. Isaiah is saying, yes, you're going to be physically returned. Isaiah is saying, yes, you're going to be spiritually returned. You got to have faith. You might not see everything all at once. So we see the physical return. We see the spiritual return. We see the temple rebuilt. We see God calling them his people. We see that relationship, heaven and earth intersecting. But the final fulfillment of that is not until Jesus comes back as a sacrifice. And watch the video on Isaiah 53. It talks about how Jesus' sacrifice worked for the people in the Old Testament. So if they had faith in God, then they were saved based on Jesus' sacrifice, even though it wouldn't happen for a good long period of time. So people are in physical bondage to Babylon. God's going to take care of that. People are in spiritual bondage to sin, and God is going to take care of that. And watch how this works out in the next 11 verses. All right, so The genre, I don't know. It's certainly poetry. It's prophecy, a call, oracle. There's a lot of calling back and forth going on here. God is calling to the prophets. God is calling to the people. The prophets are calling to God. So maybe this is a call oracle. You could make an argument about that. But what it's really doing is it's promising comfort, and it's describing how that comfort is going to happen. So God, the people are saying, we're slaves in exile to Babylon. God says, okay, I'll take care of that. I'm going to destroy Babylon, or I'm going to cause Cyrus to send you back home. No problem, I can do it. And I will send you a servant. We see more in Isaiah 53 about that God's servant and what he does. But I will send a servant to restore you spiritually. All you got to do is trust me. You're away from Israel, you're away from the temple, but you're not away from your God. We'll talk about the themes more in each verse, but we see the sovereignty of God over and over and over and over and over in this. God has said it, it will happen. Again, just as certain as the judgment was in chapters 1 through 39, God's comfort for the remnant is just as certain in 40 through 66. So there are no surprises. God is in control. God will provide. And we see that in this passage. And God is calling. God is calling to his people just like he has always called to his people. Like he called to the people in the wilderness in the Exodus. Like he calls to us today. God is constantly calling. We also see the mercy of God towards his people. The punishment is over, we'll see. And God is going to restore the people in all ways, physically and spiritually. He'll send a servant to do it. And we see very, very strongly this idea of Messiah, God's servant. It's not quite so clear in this passage, again, more clear in Isaiah 53 and some others, but it's clear to us from a New Testament perspective that this is a prophecy about Jesus. This is a prophecy about the Messiah, not a Messiah like Cyrus or David or Moses or some of those guys, but this is the Messiah that's going to come back, that will fulfill all of God's promises and will make us in a right relationship with God. So that's sort of the background. Now let's look at the text. 41 says, "Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God." That's the kind of thing you want to hear from God. And actually, a better translation might be, "Y'all keep on comforting my people." Okay, so this is a message to the prophets. God is talking to the prophets, Isaiah and all the other prophets that are associated with the exile, Jeremiah. And he's saying, comfort my people. Tell them that the punishment is over. Now, again, depending on when the prophecy is made, punishment might not be over. It might still be in the exile. But to God's mind, it is so certain, it is as if it has already happened. So you can take comfort, O faithful remnant. God is going to do this, okay? So just, again, verse 39 was judgment. 40 and following is comfort, and God is going to make sure that that happens. And it's interesting here, he also talks about my people and your God. It emphasizes that personal relationship, that they may have felt like that God has abandoned them, but God does not feel like he has abandoned them. God's covenant love is faithful. It will endure. It will endure even if the people's faithfulness does not endure. So God has promised to provide, and God will provide. He reminds the prophets to remind the people, I am their God and they are my people. So speak kindly to Jerusalem. Give them a message of comfort. We see this repetition here in poetry. Anytime you see repetition is emphasis. So emphasize that there is comfort coming. The punishment is over for the remnant. There is restoration. I will take care of everything they need. So it's the idea of it's a relationship. These are my people and I am their God, even though there is no temple, even though they may feel like they've lost the Torah, even though they may feel like there's no promised land. And again, we start to see that this tie-in with the Exodus, because during the Exodus, they didn't have the Torah, they didn't have the promised land, but they had God. And that was the important thing, that God was with them even though they didn't have those other things. So they can be in a right relationship with God in Babylon. They can be with a right relationship with God anywhere. And of course, from a New Testament perspective, we can be in a right relationship with God anywhere. We don't have a temple anymore. We don't need a temple anymore because Jesus has provided for us. So look at chapter 40, verse 2. Speak kindly to Jerusalem and call out to her that her warfare is ended. Her iniquity has been removed, that she has received of the Lord's hand double for all her sins. So why can Jerusalem have comfort? Well, he gives 3 reasons, all right? So it's the war is ended. Their iniquity has been removed. Interesting, if we had more time, we'd dig deeper there. Their equity, their price has been paid. So they have paid the price and even more. So it's like God is saying, okay, the judgment is enough. That I am finished punishing you, and now I'm ready to comfort my faithful remnant. All right? And again, as I said before, now that's a wonderful message, and that's a good message for the people. It's a message of encouragement, particularly if you're a slave in Babylon. God's still your God. Your punishment is over. God is going to restore you. But again, there's that old Jewish rabbi in the back that's going, yeah, but God, how are you going to do that? And that's what the next passages are going to be saying. God is going to say, this is how I'm going to do it. And it's an interesting way that God puts this in perspective. So let's look at verse 4. Verse 3. A voice is calling, clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness, make smooth in the desert a highway for your God. Now, if we don't read that carefully, we might say, okay, well, God's going to make a path for the people. But I could be wrong here, but if I read that carefully, what it's saying is clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness. This is not clear a way for the people. This is clear a way for the Lord. This path is for God. God first, and then the people, okay? And remember, this is the God that's calling is the Creator Yahweh. If Yahweh wants a path in the wilderness, there will be a path in the wilderness. Now God will come first, but then this will be a path also for the nations to come to Jerusalem, as we see spelled out in greater detail in other places in Isaiah. So this is a path for the Lord. This is a path for a royal progression for God to return to Jerusalem. Okay, so this is saying, I'm going to take care of you. I am going to make a path in the wilderness, and I am going to go back to Jerusalem. And if I'm in Jerusalem, everything's okay, because the presence of the Lord solves all problems. Now, you can also use my path to get to Jerusalem, and it's going to be a smooth path. I'm going to take care of you. Cyrus is going to free you and give you money to go back to Jerusalem. I got that covered, guys. I got your physical return covered, and I'm going to lead you in a royal progression. And again, you can follow me. And then I'm also, as we see in this passage later, I'm going to spiritually restore you. So all your problems are going to be taken care of. And this is, I am your God, and all of your problems are solved with my presence. Dig a little bit deeper here in the verse 3. Clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness. Now, again, we talked about Old Testament parallels, but in the wilderness is a key term for the Hebrews. It doesn't mean a whole lot to us, but that is actually the title in Hebrew of the book of Numbers. So if we were speaking Hebrew here and I wanted to tell you to go to the book of Numbers, I would say go to Bamidbar, and that is literally in Hebrew in the wilderness. We call it Numbers because it's got all the census and stuff like that. But to the Hebrews, it's called in the wilderness. So part of this message is that book, the book of Numbers, the book of the Exodus, the book of where God is with the people even when they rebel, and God provides the manna, and God provides the water, and God provides everything for the people. So we're pulling in that path in the desert, that path in the wilderness. Just like God was with them in the Exodus, God is with them in the exile. God will provide for them in the exile just like He provided for them in the Exodus. There is nothing missing. God will provide. Okay? Now, of course, from a New Testament perspective, this is also the passage that John the Baptist uses to describe Jesus. So remember, God's presence never comes back to the temple in those Old Testament times, 500 AD to the time of Jesus. But Jesus is coming back to the temple. God is progressing to the temple. And John the Baptist is quoting Isaiah to say, remember what Isaiah was talking about? That path in the wilderness and the royal progression and God coming back to the temple? It's getting ready to happen. And the person who's going to do it is Jesus, because He is the one that was described and promised in Isaiah. So this is strong New Testament implications here. Now, just from a physical point of view, a smooth road is a good thing to have back into Jerusalem, because to get to Jerusalem from the east, you have to go down to the Jordan Valley and then back up to Jerusalem, and from the Jordan Valley back up to Jerusalem it's a road of about, I think, 15 miles, and it rises 3,500 feet. So it's uphill the whole way, which means you had to go downhill the whole way to get there. So a nice smooth road is just good. God is going to make it easy. There won't be any bumps. There won't be any hills and valleys and stuff like that. There will be an easy road to Jerusalem. Now, it doesn't mean people will take it, because we're getting into a little bit of the poetry here. When we say road, you might want to call it a path, and we all think of something physical. But remember, there's a spiritual connotation here. This is not just the physical road to Jerusalem. This is the spiritual path to a correct relationship with God. And the idea of road and path is important here, because John, again, uses it, the way of road or path. In the Gospel of Mark, the road or the path is very, very important. The way is sometimes the way it's described. And what it's talking about is not a physical road, but a process. In Mark, it's a process, the discipleship of following Jesus to salvation. If you are on the road, if you are a follower of Jesus on the way, that's the mark of being a disciple. We see this in blind Bartimaeus, 2/3 of the way through the book of Mark. He follows Jesus on the way, code word for becoming a disciple, because Jesus is the way. You may think about that from the Gospel of John. I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. The process to get to God, not the physical path, but the spiritual path or process to get to God, is Jesus. So this physical and spiritual path that Isaiah is promising, physical is fulfilled early. The spiritual will be fulfilled later in the time of Jesus, and that's when the nations will come to Jerusalem. That God will be open to everybody. An Ethiopian eunuch can follow along the way, be a follower of Jesus. A Roman can be a follower of the Jesus. In fact, the early Christians weren't Christians. I've said this before, but the early Christians were Jews. They were from Jerusalem or whatever. So as the church spread, they weren't called Christians until we see the church spreading to Antioch in maybe the 50s or so. But the early Christians were Jews who were called followers of the way. That was the mark of these people who were following Jesus. You were a disciple of Jesus, or you were a follower of the way, a follower of the path. And that's the path and the way that Isaiah is talking about here. So we have just a super strong New Testament parallel here for everybody. So note the poetry here. You get the valleys and the hills and the road and the way, and it's repeated over and over again to be emphasis. Let every valley be lifted up. Let every hill and mountain be made low. Let the rough ground become a plain and the rugged terrain a broad valley. Right. So we see that again, physically a nice road, but spiritually, all the barriers between mankind and God can be overcome through Jesus. There is a straight path to Jesus. You don't have to worry about anything. Again, think of the Ethiopian eunuch. He's come to Jerusalem to learn about God, and he's been turned away from the temple, probably because he's a eunuch. And in the book of Acts, we see him talking to a disciple, a follower of the way, and says, is there any reason I can't become someone like you? I can't be baptized? And he's told, no, there's no reason, because it's the condition of your heart. The condition of your body, the ups and downs of the body, all that stuff don't matter anymore. It's your spirit. And if your spirit is right, you have a straight, easy path to God. No hills, no valleys. You can get to God through Jesus. So again, we see this super strong New Testament parallel. So again, sovereignty of God, mercy of God, the Messiah. We see that all coming up in here. God is going to take care of things. All right, let's look at verse 5. Then the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all flesh will see it together. That's interesting. All flesh, not just the Jews, not just the Hebrews, it's all flesh will see that. So this is something that everyone is going to participate in. Then the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all flesh will see it, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Now, the mouth of the Lord is not so certain, but it's not who is speaking it, it's what he is speaking or she is speaking. So the mouth of the Lord is speaking God's word, and if God has said it, it will happen. Again, sovereignty of God. Think back to Isaiah 6, when Isaiah is sort of purified for his message. He says, I'm a people, unclean people and unclean lips, and his mouth is purified from the coals from the altar. So the mouth of God is purified to speak the true message of God, and the true message of God will be fulfilled. And the message is, the glory of the Lord will be revealed. Now, again, Old Testament, we see that in the Exodus, the glory of the Lord is in the tabernacle. The glory of the Lord comes to Moses. We see that in the New Testament too, because Jesus is the glory of the Lord. John talks in his gospel about the glory of God is revealed in Jesus, and Jesus will be exalted. Now, what he's talking about is the crucifixion. So there's this whole turnaround here that, you're looking for a powerful king, and that's who Jesus is, but the powerful king gives his life for his people. And then the resurrection kind of reverses the shame of the cross. I'm skipping over a 3-hour lecture here. Pardon me. But Jesus dies for his people, and he's exalted because of that. God's glory shows through Jesus. So we see the Old Testament perspective, but this very, very strong New Testament perspective here. Jesus reveals God's glory in judgment and mercy and comfort and restoration. Jesus is the fulfillment of all of God's covenant promises. Right? So the glory of the Lord here, go back to verse 5. Then the glory of the Lord will be revealed. The word glory here is an important Hebrew word. It's chesed. Remember, you have to have phlegm to speak Hebrew, so it's chesed. And it talks about God's covenant love, God's merciful love. All those promises that God has made, they don't change. God will fulfill them. Man goes up, man goes down, man does good, man does bad, and man breaks the covenant, but God never changes. And just like God didn't change in the Exodus, God's not going to change in the exile. And from our perspective, God's not going to change today. God's covenant love is exactly the same as it always has been. And it's all those promises of the covenant are fulfilled in the person of Jesus. So we can rest assured that just like the Exodus happened and God was there, just like the exile happened and God is there, when COVID or coronavirus happens, God is still there. We have not been abandoned. God is still with us. So let's look at this next passage now. A voice says, "Call out," which I'm assuming that that's God calling out because it's singular. And then he answered, and I'm guessing here this is the prophet. And the prophet says, "What shall I call out?" Okay, you've said you're going to make this path. We're going to return. How are we going to do that? We don't have concrete. We don't have asphalt. We're slaves. All the objections. What shall I call out? All flesh is grass, and all its loveliness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. A lot of poetry here, a lot of repetition. The grass withers twice. I don't know anything that dies quicker than grass in the desert. Okay, so that's an image that they pick up on. But they're talking about the helplessness of humanity. And again, interesting word here. Go back to verse 6. All flesh is grass, and all its loveliness is like the flower of the field. Again, talking about the impermanence, the changeableness, the fallibility of humanity. But the word here for loveliness is chesed again. So it's like mankind can't maintain covenant love. Mankind goes up, goes down, he withers, but God will maintain the covenant love because they're kind of contrasting God's chesed earlier and mankind's chesed. So the good news is all of these promises are not based on mankind's chesed. If it were, we'd be in all kinds of trouble because we change and fail and we're like the grass that withers in the desert. But the punchline of all of this is the grass withers, the flower fades. Yeah, I got that. Mankind is fallible. But the word of our God relationship stands forever. So these promises, the message, the calling is not based on something I say. It's not based on something Isaiah says. It's not based on what somebody else says. It's based on what God says. And if God says it, it's gonna happen. So that's the sovereignty of God again. All right, now we're getting ready to sum up here at the end. Look at verses 9 through 11. Get yourself up on a high mountain so everybody can hear. And again, Jerusalem geographically is the highest mountain around. So if you're in Jerusalem, you're on the temple, you're on the highest mountain. Repetition here. O Zion, bearer of good news, lift up your voice mightily. O Jerusalem, bearer of good news, lift it up and do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. That is the answer to everything. If God is with you, you got it. Because God has promised you all kinds of things, and God will fulfill those promises. All right, so the presence of God doesn't matter about the temple, doesn't matter about the Torah, doesn't matter about the promised land, doesn't matter about anything. If He is our God, and if He is present, I don't have to worry. And we see this over and over again in the Bible. So this is a common theme, Old Testament and the New Testament. So go up to someplace high where everybody can see you and hear you, and spread the good news. Now, the idea of bearer of good news is the king's herald. So when the king has good news, the herald goes out and spreads it. From a New Testament perspective, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on this, but I think it's accurate. I have to take a step back and do a little bit of explaining here. In the 200s BC, Alexander the Great had conquered the world, and Greek culture had become very, very popular. Everybody wanted to be Greek. Everyone was speaking Greek, pretty much. Everyone was speaking Greek so much that even the Hebrews were losing the ability to read Hebrew. So there became a need to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek so everybody could read the Bible. And this Greek translation of the Old Testament is called the Septuagint, or the LXX sometimes. And it's interesting to us because it helps us figure out what these Old Testament people were talking about, because we might not know what a Hebrew word, bearer of good news, might have meant in 250 BC. We have limited resources to tell us that. But what we do know is Jewish scholars of the time looked at that Hebrew word and said, you know what, here is a good Greek word that means the same thing, and we're going to use that in our translation. Now, the good news is we've got all kinds of references for what Greek words mean, and it gives us a very good idea of what they're talking about. Now, a long way to go to get to the point, but the Greek word here for bearer of good news is euangelion. And we know this from the New Testament, because if somebody is spreading the euangelion, they are spreading the good news. And that's actually where we get the term evangelist. So I'm not saying it's a direct tie-in here, but I'm saying it's the same kind of thing. It's a bearer of good news in the Old Testament. It's a bearer of good news in the New Testament. Jesus is the path to the Lord. That stuff Isaiah was talking about 500 years ago, 600 years ago. Jesus is it. You heard about the good news. I'm telling you the good news. I am spreading the good news. I am the King's herald. I am God's herald, and His Son has come to redeem you and solve all the problems you have between you and God. So if you want spiritual restoration, here is the path, here is the way. So that's just very, very important. Again, we talked about the presence of God. Here is your God is the solution to everything. So let's look at verses 10 and 11. Behold, the Lord your God will come with might, with His arm ruling for Him. That's the ruling arm, right? The military power. And behold, His reward is with Him, and His recompense before Him. And look at the idea of judgment and reward going on here. But look what happens in verse 11. Like a shepherd, He will tend His flock. In His arm, He will gather the lambs and carry them in His bosom. He will gently lead them to nursing ewes. So we get real excited about the arm of the Lord, but somehow the arm of the Lord turns into the loving shepherd. And this was a hard concept for the Jews to understand. They're thinking in, Hebrews understand, they're thinking in military terms. They're real excited about the arm of the Lord, but the one that's doing all the action is the shepherd of the Lord. And of course, it makes sense to us because we understand Jesus is the good shepherd who knows His sheep, who lays His life down for His sheep as a sacrifice. And again, read Isaiah 53. There's a lot more in there about that. But to us, this makes perfect sense. To the Hebrews, it might have been kind of confusing, and it might have been one of the reasons they sort of missed Jesus. Because they're looking for the right arm of the Lord that'll come in and kick some, Romans out of Jerusalem, out of Israel. They're looking for a military power of God to come with them. And Jesus comes to them not as He is the right arm of God, comes to them as a shepherd. Now, they're used to shepherds who become kings. Think about David. David was a shepherd. He became king. But they're not used to kings who become shepherds. and they totally miss Jesus, and this might be one of the reasons why. So Jesus is the shepherd, and Jesus is going to lead the triumph. It's not going to be a military triumph. Jesus is going to, and I'm poetry and symbolism here, but Jesus is going to lead the nations back to God. Jesus is going to be the path to bring everyone back to God, to bring everyone to Jerusalem, where mankind can be right with God. Right? Now, it's interesting that the things we're talking about here, this idea of Jerusalem or Zion, is where Abraham attempted to sacrifice Isaac. And God provided a ram. Jehovah Jireh is God. Jehovah will always Jireh. It's kind of my joke, right? But God provided, and God will provide. The same place that Abraham attempted to sacrifice Isaac is where Jesus dies crucified, dies for our sins. So God provided the ultimate sacrifice so we can have a path to God. So I promised you one last aha or parallel or something like that you probably hadn't thought of. God has made a promise. God has shown them how he will fulfill the promise. God has shown us how he will fulfill the promise. Now, remember the Septuagint and the LXX, the Greek translation. You go all the way back to Isaiah 41 and that idea of comfort. The Hebrews, when they wrote the Septuagint, translated that word comfort as Pericleo. Now, that might not mean a lot to you, but it literally in Greek it means comforter. But that is the Greek word that's used in the New Testament in the Gospel of John when Jesus says, I have to go and I'm sending you another one after me. And he's sending them the Pericleo. He is sending them the comforter. So I, again, don't want to read too much into this, but I think it's a valid parallel. God is promising a Pericleo, a comforter, in Isaiah 40 verse 1, and God provides that Pericleo, that comforter, that counselor in the Holy Spirit. So we no longer have to worry about whether we are in the presence of God, because we are promised the presence of God inside us in the New Testament. We have that Holy Spirit inside us. We no longer have to worry about a prophet to bring a message to us. We no longer have to worry about the path to God. We no longer have to worry about temple or Torah or promised land. We have God inside us. The presence of God is right here. If the presence of God solves all our problems are solved. We just have to have faith in God because he is here inside us all the time. We have the comfort that was promised in Isaiah, and we have it promised that it will never go away. Now, how does this work out for us today? It should give us comfort. Regardless of what happens, God is in control. The worst the world can do is kill us, and God has shown us that he can fix that in no longer than 3 days. Right? And I don't think it would take him 3 days to resurrect us. He waited 3 days because of the prediction to resurrect Jesus. God's going to take care of that. Even more important than our life is our relationship with God and our payment for the price of sins. God's got taken care of that through Jesus. So we should be encouraged. We should be empowered. We have God inside us. We have the path to God inside us. And we should offer that to other people. We should offer other people a trip on the road, a trip along the way, and allow them to become a follower. So we should be encouraged to the world. When bad things in the world happen, we shouldn't be surprised. Those are the mountains and the valleys. It's Satan's world, and bad things are going to happen. But God has promised us that he's going to make it right, and he's given us his presence so that we know that it will be made right. So we should be encouraged in times like this, the coronavirus or whatever. We should be able to live a life of confidence that certainly we mourn when bad things happen, but we know there is more than just this world. And we should be able to show that confidence to the world and share God's message about the path to God through Jesus to the world. So, probably more than you wanted to know about the first 11 verses of Isaiah 40, but I hope it gave you some idea of the amount of detail you can get into in your papers. Don't expect you to always have this much detail, but just an example of how you can dig deep occasionally. I wanted to give you an example of the historical context, the literary context. This was a great passage for New and Old Testament parallels because there's just a bunch of them. And I hope you see how this application works out in your daily life, and I hope you are encouraged and comforted by the presence of God in you. So until next time, shalom, y'all.